Kia ora, I'm Richard Martin, in for Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. Auckland is under pressure to make space for 2 million homes, and councillors have little choice in the matter. On September 24th, the city's Policy and Planning Committee will decide whether to press ahead with the existing Plan Change 78, which allows three-storey housing across most of the city, or back a new plan that concentrates apartment blocks up to 15 stories around key transport hubs. Both options have sparked heated debate, from fears of flooding and towers overshadowing suburban homes to arguments that the city desperately needs more density to tackle the housing crisis. Minister for RMA Reform, Chris Bishop, has made it clear that Auckland must provide for growth while promising locals a stronger voice in how it plays out. So, what's really at stake for Aucklanders, and how much power does the council actually have? Today on The Front Page, New Zealand Herald senior reporter Simon Wilson joins us to break down the battle over Auckland's housing future. All right, so first off, Simon, what exactly are these zoning changes that have been proposed?
At the moment, Auckland Council has a plan in place that says that it will create the capacity for 2 million homes in the city over the coming decades. This is a requirement of the previous government and has been in place with the existing government until now. The existing government, however, told Auckland Council that it could get out of that option if it produced a new plan that still allowed for 2 million homes, but didn't have the instruction that was there in the Labour plan that pretty much all property could be subdivided, and pretty much all property, even subdivided, could go up to 3 stories. So the Auckland Council has produced a new draft plan change that proposes there will be the capacity for all those homes. It doesn't mean they'll all be built, but it's a capacity. But it focuses the development around train stations, along arterial roads, and in town centres, places where there is already the infrastructure for denser development, and at the same time has recognised, because the government has instructed it to keep the 2 million capacity, it's recognised that it has to also allow more density in various other parts of the city. So some of the suburbs and some parts of some of the suburbs will have a denser capacity than is currently the case.
And so you mentioned the Labour government putting the thing in place. That's the Plan Change 78,
That's
which
correct.
has been this controversial sort of directive. Parts of that have been progressed, but why is the government looking to replace that so soon?
So Plan Change 78 is based on something called the MDRS, the Medium Density Residential Standards. These were originally introduced by Labour and National. Under the Labour government, there was a coalition deal that they would both support them. And the idea there was that it took the very contentious housing issue away from partisan politics, because both sides agreed and recognised that long-term development of the city was required, and we weren't going to get it if it became too much a question of party squabbling. So that was the plan. But National reneged on that deal before the last election. So the MDRS was what said that basically everything can go up to 3 stories anywhere, and there's a lot of opposition to that. The new plan change proposal comes in under the government saying, okay, you can be more flexible about it. You can do more density where it's a good idea to do it, and not have as much density where it's more problematic.
Yeah, because there's talk of, obviously the Auckland floods might be a contributing factor. There's been sort of discussion that, it's addressing zoning issues in those high-risk areas. How much of that actually is?
Now, that is an important part of it. Under the MDRS and Plan Change 78, the rules were that you couldn't downsize the capacity of sections. So where after the anniversary weekend floods and Cyclone Gabrielle at the beginning of 2023, Auckland Council recognised really clearly that it had a whole range of parts of the city where they were at risk of flooding or coastal erosion, and it was not a good idea to allow more housing in those places. In fact, the reverse had to occur. But the regulations prevented the down zoning of those areas. So the new plan allows for that. So they have established a whole range of areas. About 80% of them are on the coast. Auckland has an enormous coastline because it's two coastlines, and the rest are flood areas that are liable to flood in the Wairau Valley, some parts of Henderson, West Auckland, Mangere, places where it is simply not appropriate to build.
So aside from just abstaining from the vote, there are two options at play here.
Well, the proposal in front of Council that they will vote on next week is to adopt the new plan change. The legal language is that they will notify it. It doesn't mean that it becomes the law. It means that it then becomes open to public consultation, and there is a lengthy process for that. If they don't notify the new plan change, then Plan Change 78, the existing one, which creates the 3x3 housing density situation, that will remain in place. So it's a yes/no on the new one, but the choice their councillors are facing are between those two options, both of which allow the capacity of 2 million homes.
I saw, Chris Bishop said that, he's promising to allow Aucklanders to have their say in that. What does that process look like?
So Bishop has announced just this week what the consultation process will be. It was always assumed there would be one, but it was unclear exactly what it would be. And so what Bishop has made clear now is that from early November until just before Christmas, there will be an open public consultation process. Now, early November is significant because that is the time when the new council, because we've got council elections underway, and that's the time when the new council will take office. So they will be in charge of that consultation. It won't be something happening in the middle of the election campaign, and that's a good thing for everybody. And then that something like 6-7 week period of public consultation will be followed next year by an independent hearings panel being established. These are experts in the field, and they will hear the submissions and consider the submissions of everybody who wants to front before them, who's submitted in that public consultation process at the end of this year. And that whole process, the Minister says, will probably take around 18 months. So there's a good period of time for the public to have their say formally as part of the process, and then there is a lengthy period of the panel considering that and hearing from that and deciding what to recommend. It is a standard process, but the Minister's now made it very clear that they're not going to circumvent that in any way. It will be done properly.
As someone who's never engaged in a public forum like that, how do those exactly work, that feedback process, and how likely is it to actually change anything?
So there will be a whole range of public submissions, and it will be as simple as you will, I imagine, going on previous experience, you'll be able to go onto the council website and fill in a form or send them a one-sentence note saying, I object to this or I love this. Through to, there will be groups that get lawyers involved and do very considered submissions. There will be groups who get planners and other experts involved and make their submissions on the basis of that. They'll spend some money. And then the independent hearings panel, their job is to filter all that and assess it. And the fact that you as a member of the public have done it cost me nothing, but I have a heartfelt opinion and I want them to know about it, they'll recognise that for what it is, and they'll consider that properly, or they're supposed to. But they will also, of course, have a whole lot of that expert submitted material as well to consider. And they'll do a balance, and the council will report on it too. They'll say, we've had this many submissions from the public, we've had this many submissions from lobby groups, we've had this many submissions from the expert areas, these are the opinions that we've had from other parts of the democratic process, like the local boards and so on. They'll report on all that. So we'll be able to see all that, and they'll probably quantify it so we'll know roughly the public opinion was 60-40 this way or that way or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But they will tell us.
Do we have any indication sort of which way council or general public are leaning between the options?
Well, there's no single view. If you go to a public meeting in Mount Eden or Remuera or Parnell, as I've been doing, you'll hear some very angry locals. If you go out to Mangere, which I did last weekend, you won't find them talking about it at all. Mangere is a fascinating suburb because it was built after the war to house the floods of people migrating to Auckland, particularly Māori from the north. It was built with hardly any proper sewage and water services. It was very, very basic. That all came to a head and was very problematic. Mangere in the last 10, 15 years has been very substantially rebuilt. There are a lot of apartments and denser housing. They've got good services. They put it in underground. It cost money to do it because they had to do it underground. And it's quite a transformed suburb now. Down there in this election, they're not talking about, oh my God, we don't want density. They've got it. They like it because it's given them warm, dry, safe houses to live in and created communities. They're talking about other issues, like employment, those sorts of things. It's very different depending on where you go. If you go up to Whangaparoa, I was there last weekend again, they're talking about the inability of infrastructure to help with development up there. And it's different again from what's happening in the central city.
Yeah, when you go to those suburbs where they are getting really fired up about this, what are the concerns that they're raising?
I think there's two main areas of concern. One of them is the minister has said that around the railway stations that are close to the central city, which he's calling the CRL stations, like what used to be Mount Eden, now to be known as Mongafo, and Kingsland and Morningside, those stations will have the capacity to take buildings that are 15 stories tall, and so people are worried about that. The second concern is not the 15 stories, but people living in leafy suburbs in nice villas with their neighbours in villas are worried that a 3 or a 6-story apartment block might appear on their street or might appear right next to them, and so that's actually fundamentally a separate concern. There are two concerns there. Quite possibly, many people would say if we're going to have growth in the city, people have to live somewhere, and putting dense living around railway stations, particularly because the CRL will transform the railway network and double its capacity, that's a good place to put them. And that's a different issue from saying, how many apartments do we want in those leafy suburbs, those villa suburbs, if you like.
Yeah, it's interesting because, we're talking about quite affluent suburbs.
Yes.
And especially, people outside of Auckland as well might be looking at these champagne problems. Are these legitimate concerns, or are these just sort of not in my backyard?
Well, it depends whether you're in one of the streets concerned. Shane Henderson, who's a councillor out at Te Atatu in the Henderson in the Waitakere ward there, he argues very strongly that Te Atatu is being completely built out with apartments because those suburbs closer to town, which have better services, much better services, particularly transport and water, are refusing to allow development there. So you could say that's NIMBYism. It's easy to say the word NIMBYism. Personally, I think that's a good example of it. Not in my backyard. It's quite literal. But of course, people who don't want the character of where they live changed, to say it's not NIMBYism, it's preserving character and heritage, and there are values that we need to look after. So, that's where they come from. One of the ironies of it is that there was a report that I wrote up over the weekend about where the demand in Auckland is for apartment living. The two suburbs with the biggest demand are Remuera and Mount Eden. And that is largely people who live there now, but whose kids have left home or they've retired. They want to downsize. They want to stay living in their suburb, but they don't want to stay living in the big family home anymore. They want somewhere smaller that is still good. So they want apartments. So while family X living in a really nice house in Remuera might not want apartment blocks near them, their neighbours who are retiring do want the apartment block because they want to live in it. So that's a inside the suburb pension, if you like.
We've picked the first 5 CRL stations. They're the most important stations. We just really want to get it into law that these stations like Kingsland, Morningside, for example, we really should be having dense apartments around there. They're not going to happen straight away. It's not like you're going to wake up tomorrow and find a 15-storey building next to Kingsland train station, but over the next few years, you will see more buildings like that in these key stations. We've come over the top with CRL, and actually the Mayor supports it. People sort of saying, well, I'm sort of forcing them to do it. And in some senses I am, in the sense that we're legislating for it. But the Mayor and I have had a lot of discussions around it, and he's actually on the press release we issued yesterday around it. So there's a lot of support from Mayor Brown and many councillors in Auckland for it.
In terms of the ones around the transport hubs we talked about, the 15-storey potentially apartment blocks, Chris Bishop mentioned that he calls them the CRL sort of things, and that's potentially opening soon, hopefully. But is that infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, going to be able to support that many more people living around those hubs?
Yes, it is. One of the things that people say in those suburbs where they don't want the density to happen is that infrastructure should happen first. If they don't want the density to happen, they probably don't want it at all, so they probably don't want the infrastructure either, Yeah. But actually, it doesn't work like that. Under the old Auckland Unitary Plan, passed in 2016, they said in 30, 50 years' time, we're going to have the capacity to do this much housing. They didn't have all the infrastructure in place. They just knew that over those decades, it would be developed. And that is what's happened, certainly with the CRL. And with wastewater also in central Auckland. So the CRL is one of the 2 really big projects that they've been building. And the other one is something called the Central Interceptor, which is a big wastewater pipe that runs right through the isthmus and takes the waste out to Mangere, where the big plants are. And that will revolutionise the capacity of Isthmus Auckland to manage wastewater, particularly when there are storms. It should mean that there is no fecal contamination on the beaches any longer. That's a major change. Mount Eden is one of the suburbs that will directly benefit from that. So that infrastructure is there. But in places where it more is needed, Parnell's a good example. Parnell pipes have burst recently, quite famously. There is a plan, Watercare has a major plan for the whole city, in fact, of when it's going to build the new infrastructure, and it's all staged according to what they understand the demand to be. So that's underway. It's not like the council's doing nothing.
It's funny, like we're talking about all these different suburbs, and like it seems that you look at the maps of the proposed changes, and it's like they've just circled an entire suburb, gone, apartments can go here, the 3 stories can go here. How much nuance is normally in something like this? So
you are right. The government put the council on a very strict timetable to get those new maps done, and some of them are AI generated.
Wow.
And there are mistakes in them. There are places in those plans where you go, that's clearly the map makers or AI, whoever it was or whatever it was, assumed that was a bigger, wider road than it is. You're just not going to be able to carry, sustain that many people living on it. So those things will change. The consultation that we will see next week when the council comes back to decide on the new plan change, there will be revisions to those maps, but there'll be more. The notification period is one of the reasons for it, is that it allows everybody to say, you've got it wrong here, and for the council to have a really good, careful look at that and to modify the plans accordingly. So there will be changes. Then Megan Tyler, who's the council's chief planning officer, she says, that's just the normal process. Of course we'll do it because that's what we always do when we have plan changes. So we can expect that happening as well.
So with these maps, though, I've read about there are overlays which then override what's been shown.
That's right. One of the examples of an overlay is flood risk, which you might say this suburb is going to be zoned for, or this part of the suburb is going to be zoned for 6-storey apartments because it's got an arterial road running through it, but actually in that part of it, it's prone to flooding there, so there'll be an overlay that protects that from development, and that is what's called a special character overlay. Another kind of special character overlay, which is much more valued by many people, is where the housing is judged to have a particular historic value. I suppose it might not be historic. It might be a subdivision of extremely exciting architecturally designed new places that are going to be preserved. But actually, that's not how it works. In reality, villas, bungalows, and other historic places where there's a concentration of historic housing, that gets an overlay on it. And the best example in Auckland is Devonport. Devonport, apart from Navy buildings, has no buildings of any height at all. There's an overlay over there. No one's been allowed to build anything. So it's just the old houses.
Yeah, and so how do these overlays come into it?
So what that means is, if you think of a place like the Mangawhau station or the Kingsland railway station, there are places near those stations that are within the walkable areas which have a concentration of historic housing. And so there's a ring on the map, if you like, that says, okay, in those areas you're not going to have the density requirements that places outside that ring will be subjected to. There are fewer special character areas preserving historic housing in the new plan change than there were in plan change 78. I think it's something like 1,500 fewer homes. Therefore, there is concern that the city could lose a number of those historic homes. When I say historic, I live in one of them. I live in a special character area where actually in our street almost all the houses are workers' cottages. They were built in the 19th century. They're very simple. But over the years, people have put false or new verandas on them in the colonial style. My house had, the previous owners to us did that. It looks very pretty, but it's fake, as are the verandas on most of my neighbours' houses. Yeah. They're fake too. But the council went down that street and went, this is lovely, and called it a special character. Yeah. So that limits the development on our street, which is, I think, kind of weird, which is not to say that genuine villa streets, as there are many in Mount Eden and Ponsonby, Grey Lynn, Devonport, etc. Not to say that they are the same. Villa streets are villa streets. Having said that, in Mount Eden, you drive around Mount Eden, you will see a lot of apartment blocks already, which happened in the 70s, and a lot of what's called sausage flats, where because the height limit was in place, developers built just to 1 or 2 stories, and there's a whole lot of apartments in a row back from the street. Yeah. And they're called sausage flats in the sense that they look like a 6-pack of sausages just sitting next to each other.
I live in one of those.
There you go.
That's what they're called.
That's what they're called, yeah. And you won't have any green space.
A very small pad.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas if that had been built as a 6-storey apartment block, you could have had a park around it, for the residents. So that's one of the reasons why people are saying actually sausage flats is not a good way to develop a suburb. The other factor that is significant in this is what's called walkable catchments. Yes. So around the city centre, Auckland city centre, there is a 1,200 metre walkable catchment. Effectively, they've said if you can walk, if it's a 15-minute walk from downtown, then you can build densely in that area. Yeah. And for the railway stations, it's an 800 metre radius for a 10-minute walk. It's not a absolute radius. It's not just a circle. They looked at the geography. They looked at the things like where the railway lines are. You can't just walk across the railway line, of course. And a good example of that is Kingsland railway station, where if it was just a circle, the walkable catchment would include Great North Road on the other side of the motorway, on the west side of the motorway. It doesn't, because that's a big dip and it's a longer walk. So the walkable catchment stops on the railway station side of the motorway. So they did take account of all that. But in those walkable catchments, it will be possible to build more densely because those are the places where they want people to live, who are close to the train station. unless there's a special character overlay. It's complicated.
Finally, I just want to circle back to something at the start. It might sound quite surprising to hear this number of 2 million homes, but that's not actually like a promise of we're going to build 2 million homes.
That's
right?
correct. And it's not 2 million more either, as many people have been saying. I find one of the ways that's quite useful to look at it is to think, if the council knows that we're going to build, let's say we're going to build 20,000 new homes a year. In fact, they've never got to that. They got to 18 in the peak year, which was 2023, slipped back a bit now to, I think it's 14 at the moment. But let's say 20. Let's say the economy picks up and growth occurs and they're doing 20. That will mean over 30 years there's something like 600,000 new homes, not the 2 million. But if they only zoned for 600,000 new homes over the next 30 years, that would mean that every homeowner, every property owner, whether you're a developer or just living in your own home, would be required to build to the maximum the zoning allows on that section. We would tell you, you own your section, but it's zoned for 3 stories, so you've got to build 3 stories. Yeah. We would tell a developer, sorry, you can't put 3-story townhouses there. We want you to put a 6-story apartment block there. And the developer would say, it's my land. I can do this the way I want to because it's my land. And they might have a very good reason for not putting 6 stories in because that's more expensive. You've got to build a stronger building. You've got to put in lifts. You've got to put in fire sprinklers and other things. It's a more expensive proposition. Some developers don't have the cash flow or don't want to take the risk to do that. We don't live in a country where people can be told what to do with their property in that way. So that's why there's a much bigger capacity than we're going to need, so that choices exist for property owners. And it also indicates that over time, although there will be more density, it absolutely does not mean there will be density everywhere.
Well, hey, thank you so much for joining. I shan't keep you any longer.
Thank you.
I know you're going to have a very busy week next week dealing with this.
Great questions.
Thank you very much for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee. I'm Richard Martin. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.